So welcome everyone. My name is Matt Bowker and I manage Rhodes Scholars virtual lecture series, and it's my pleasure to host today's virtual lecture. And today you'll be hearing from Leslie Stoltz. Leslie Stoltz is a naturalist based just outside Yellowstone National Park. And over the course of her career, she has worked for the National Park Service in both Glacier and Yellowstone. Additionally, Leslie's time with the National Park Service has provided a wonderful foundation for her career as a teacher and guide in national parks around the Rocky Mountain West. She has been an instructor on Rhodes Scholar programs in Yellowstone for 25 years. So let's have a warm virtual welcome for Leslie.
Thanks, Matt. So, hey everyone, I'm Leslie Stoltz, and I'm excited to be here today to talk with you about bears. And but first, I want to say thanks to Rhodes Scholar for the opportunity to do this, and thanks for Matt and everyone who's helping on the technical side as well. So today we'll talk primarily about bears that you'll find in the lower 48 states of North America, which include the grizzly bear and the black bear. But I really wanted to mention the fact that bears are found all over the world, primarily throughout Asia, Europe, and in South America throughout the Andes. You might have rare sightings of the spectacled bear. But today we will focus on black bear and the grizzly bear. When I worked with the National Park Service in Glacier, I had a great opportunity to work with the Greater Glacier Bear Project. And the focus of this project was getting information about bear populations, and in doing that, trying to find non-invasive ways to investigate population trends rather than trapping bears and drugging and collaring bears to get specific population numbers. So this involved covering sections of trail over and over again many times, rigorous field work, quantitative and qualitative analysis of all the data that we collected over about 10 years, period of 10 years, which I didn't work on the project that long. But at the end, we were able to get some indications of trends where bears were traveling and how many individual bears might be found in the area. So ultimately, this was the foundation, and it led to collecting over 5,000 hair samples throughout the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. And these hair samples were taken off of trees that were found throughout this ecosystem. And with state-of-the-art DNA analysis, we were able to, or this project was able to find approximately 200 individual bears, between 180 and 220 bears. Most of you know Yogi, this bear. He has a reputation for being smarter than the average bear, which is a pretty smart bear because bears are known for their intelligence, and oftentimes they're compared to having intelligence of some of the higher primates. So one species of bear we'll talk about is the black bear, Ursus americanus. And these bears evolved in North America, so they became quite comfortable in deep forests, moving through forested areas, climbing trees, and ultimately they evolved to have much shorter claws than the grizzly bears, which gives them much a better ability of climbing trees. You'll see in this photo, this bear is an almost black colored bear. Black bears are found in a variety of colors. So the name black bear is a little bit deceiving. You might see some really black colored bears. You might see browns, all shades of brown, sometimes a cinnamon color. And on the west coast of British Columbia, there's actually a race of Ursus americanus that is kind of a creamy, almost a white color that's referred to as the spirit bear. Black bears, some of their landmarks, their identifying characteristics would be ears that look a little bit larger than some of the brown or grizzly bears. No hump on the back of their neck. In fact, it's more of a sloping back. Their nose is more of a long, narrow nose, and I mentioned before that their claws are much shorter. So again, black bears evolved in the forests. They spend time in the trees when the adults, primarily the females that are caring for the cubs, when they feel their cubs are threatened, they'll send them right up a tree. And this is a protective mechanism or defensive mechanism. The cubs are also, and the adults are also climbing trees looking for food, sometimes just practicing defense, and oftentimes the cubs are just up in the trees playing. You'll see comparative ranges of where black bears are found throughout North America now versus where they were found historically. So their ranges have become much smaller than they were, although they're found much more broadly and widely spread than the brown bear, the grizzly bear. Okay, so this is an image of a grizzly bear, which is a subspecies of brown bear. And brown bears migrated across the land bridge from Asia to North America about 200,000 years ago. And as they migrated south, they had different food sources, different habitats, and ultimately today, we've got a subspecies in the lower 48, the northern part of the Rockies in the lower 48, as well as northern or southern Canada. And this is Ursus Arctos horribilis. I don't know if it really deserves that subspecies name, but this is the grizzly bear. They have a reputation for being really aggressive. Some people think they're kind of a scary animal. This behavior actually has its role. They're not necessarily big, scary animals. They're interesting. People are really curious about bears. And so typically that aggressive kind of behavior, which evolved from living in these wide open spaces. They were first found in the steppes of Asia and then prairies in Western United States. But they had developed this aggressive behavior in protecting as a protective behavior. So grizzly bears are not necessarily out there just to eat human beings. They're typically, if they're aggressive, they're in a protective mode, or they've been scared. So just want to clarify that we are not necessarily part of their food, their diet. So as I mentioned, the aggressive behavior is really demonstrated when they feel threatened, when they feel their young are threatened, or if they feel like a food source is threatened. Bears have a very highly developed sense of smell and hearing. So oftentimes people get a sense of aggression, again, when the bear is standing up. And in fact, this is an aggressive posture. It's actually a posture of curiosity or just trying to get a sense of what's going on around them. So grizzly bears versus black bears do have a large hump of muscle behind their neck, which is developed because of their digging activity. They've got much longer claws than black bears, and so they spend a lot of time digging for their food. They do have this concave shaped face, and their ears oftentimes appear a little bit smaller because they've got a big ruff of fur around. They oftentimes have a big ruff of fur around their face. Coloration is a tough one. Again, like black bears, grizzly bears oftentimes are found in a variety of different colors. One that's seen, fairly often is this silver tipping, which is where the name grizzly came from. The fur trappers refer to this as the old grizzled bear. Again, These grizzly bears have long claws, which are good for digging, and they spend a lot of their time digging for food. This is actually a bear that I saw maybe a month ago. It walked through a ranch where I was a guest, and it was a much darker bear than the one I just showed you. Sometimes grizzly bears can even be black in color. This image shows you their historical range west of the Mississippi River. They were found all over this region. There could have been as many as 50,000 grizzlies and brown bears. Today in the lower 48, they're found in isolated areas in the northern part of the Rockies in this area, and then through Alberta, British Columbia, and all the way up to Alaska. So this is a petroglyph, which is an image that's carved into, in this case, a canyon wall in the American Southwest. And petroglyphs were kind of like a calling card or a message board for early people. And this petroglyph is an image of a bear. And North American Indian people have historically had a strong association with bears. They're a symbol, the bears were a symbol of strength and intelligence. And even today, they're considered to be a source of wisdom and healing powers. So if an individual belonged to a clan whose symbol was the bear, they belonged to the strongest clan of the area. Bear populations were impacted by settlement. Prior to settlement, there was prospecting and fur trapping and exploration, and all of these events gave way to bears retreating from the prairies into the remote mountain ranges where they're found today. So I'm going to change my focus a little bit and talk about a typical year in the life of a bear. And I'll start in the fall time of the year when bears, they've been feeding all summer, putting on as much fat as they can. They start looking for den sites this time of the year when the snow starts to fall. And a female bear, if she has bred in the spring, the prior spring successfully, and she's been carrying fertilized eggs all summer, close to the time of going into her den, those eggs will implant into the uterine wall and start to grow. Prior to that, they were just in a dormant state. And so when the female gets a message from her body saying, you've got enough body fat to survive the winter in the den, have your cubs and feed your cubs, you're good to go, then those eggs start to grow. And this is a remarkable adaptation called delayed implantation. Black bears typically den, or they find existing cavities to den. It might be under the roots of a tree, it might be in a cave or in spaces between rocks. But again, remember, they're not diggers. Both black bears and grizzly bears, as they enter their den, they go into dormancy. Their metabolism drops, they're not eating or drinking, they're not excreting waste products. In fact, they reabsorb the metabolic waste to create proteins that minimizes muscle loss during hibernation. It's another miraculous adaptation. A pregnant female will give birth about 6 weeks after she goes into the den. The young, the cubs are less than a pound, maybe they're a pound. They have very fine hair, their eyes are closed, and they will continue to nurse throughout the winter. So they're growing throughout the winter. Mom is in this kind of hazy stage where she'll roll over and give them access for nursing and intentionally not roll over and crush those little cubs. By the time they come out of the den, early to mid-April, they'll be about 7 to 10 pounds, and they hit the ground running. They're very active, very curious. These cubs of the year will continue to nurse all summer long, but they're definitely learning how to survive. They're playing with each other. They're learning social skills. Mom is feeding, and they're going to be tasting the food that mom's eating, but they are also nursing throughout that first summer. Grizzly bears tend to den in higher elevations. They dig a new den each year. The grizzly bear dens tends to collapse as the snow melts out after the bears have emerged. So they dig a new den every year. Oftentimes it's on a north-facing slope. They want to make sure that they get snowed in for the winter. So a pregnant grizzly bear will emerge from the den, similar to black bear, and those cubs stay with mom. Cubs of the year stay with mom throughout the summer. Again, lots of play behavior, learning survival skills, tasting a lot of food that mom's eating, getting into trouble. And so, again, they will all go back into the den for the second winter. The following spring, they'll come out as yearling cubs. They'll be much larger. This summer, it's kind of a make it or break it summer for these cubs, because at this point in time, it's pretty important for them to figure out how to survive on their own. They're learning to find their own food, they're perfecting their survival skills, and it's rare that cubs go back into the den with mom a third winter. Sometimes it happens, but you know, her goal is to be in the den by herself and then come out of the den the following spring ready to breed again. So, talking about bears, I really want to mention the fact that if you're in an area where there are bears, it's important to know how to travel safely in bear country. So, where I live in the Yellowstone area and all the Greater Yellowstone Area and surrounding ecosystem, when we are going out for a hike or horseback or mountain bike ride or whatever people are doing, they always ensure that they have a canister of this high pressure caspase pepper, which is called bear spray. And this is not used like insect spray. You don't spray it on yourself. You have that handy and ready to use in the event that you're in a situation where you might feel threatened by a bear. But you can prevent that kind of situation by traveling in these areas, typically in groups where you'll be talking and making some noise. If you're traveling through an area where there's thick brush or a stream that's running, there's a lot of background noise, you want to make sure and make some extra loud sounds. But the key is to stay very alert and aware of your surroundings. And you'll enjoy your time outside anyway if you pay more attention to what you're seeing. The other thing to do is look for clues that tell you if there's bears out there and if they've been out there recently. In the spring or the fall, you might have snow on the ground, and that's a good time to look for bear tracks in the snow. And you should typically be able to tell or see how recent that bear track was left there. Looking at this diagram, you can understand, or you'll get a sense for what kind of bear it is by looking at the alignment of the toes, how far the claw marks out from the toes. The grizzly bear's claws, again, are much longer. The black bear toes claws are shorter. And then the black bear in their hind foot has this wedge in the instep, which the grizzly bear does not. It has more of a pointed heel. So if you've had a chance to get a up close and personal look at the front foot of a grizzly bear, those long claws are really apparent. Or if you're looking up at the pad of a black bear's foot, which I hope that you never do, you're going to see that this instep is really prominent, which a grizzly bear does not have. Other signs when you're hiking in the woods that there's bears out there, yes, they do poop in the woods. And when you find bear scat, I usually take a stick and poke it with a stick so I can get a sense how long it's been there, how fresh it is, and maybe even get a sense of what they've been eating. Grizzly bears are, I've mentioned many times, how they are efficient diggers. And when you come across an area where it looks like a rototiller has passed through there, and you've just got huge sections and holes that have been dug up and maybe rocks that have been thrown around, you can bet that there's been a grizzly there, maybe digging for small rodents, or oftentimes they're digging for roots and tubers that are present, which they'll eat hundreds, if not thousands of these in one afternoon to get enough calories to take them to the next feeding source. And there's lots of different species of vegetation and wildflowers that we'll find this time of the year. As we move into late spring and early summer, we're starting to see this plant, which is a glacial lily, growing alongside spring beauties, which both have delectable roots and tubers, which the bears love. Later in the summer, actually, as the berries start to ripen, that's another really favorite food source for the bears. Bears do tend to eat a lot of fruit when it's available and when it's ripe. In Glacier Park, there was an abundance of these mountain ash berries, as well as huckleberries. Huckleberries are really similar to blueberries, same genus, different species. And throughout Glacier Park, in the late summer and early fall, the ripening of the huckleberries is a kind of a call to all bears. And grizzly bears and black bears will congregate in specific areas where the huckleberries are dense, and they'll tolerate each other much more easily, much more readily when there's an abundant food source like that. And bears can actually gain 3 to 5 pounds a day eating these huckleberries. Kind of an unusual phenomenon that started to happen, or people started to talk about when I was with the research in Glacier. People started to call in reports that they were seeing bears up on the mountaintops rolling boulders off the top of these mountains. And we all thought, what's going on? What are they doing up there? And it wasn't something that any of us had been familiar with or heard much about. And ultimately, it was recognized that these moths, these miller moths, which were the moth of the army cutworm, were congregating and hibernating to the higher elevation, the mountains and the Rocky Mountains higher elevations, where they would estivate, or it's a summer hibernation. And the bears figured this out, that there was thousands, if not millions, of these moths beneath the rocks up in the high mountains. And they were climbing up to these mountains, rolling these rocks over, maybe eating 40,000 moths a day, which equates to about 20,000 calories. That is a high, dense source of food. And as the bears are putting on layers of fat, it gives them a much better chance of surviving winter in the den. Other kinds of food sources and clues that bears might be out there. When you come across decomposing wood and you see these stumps or down logs that look like they've been torn apart, this is a good indication that there's been black bear activity, just ripping this wood apart, excavating for insects. Stripped trees, the lower part of a tree that looks as though it's just been torn open. The strips of bark are at the base of the tree. This is an indication that bears have been peeling this bark, trying to get at the sugars in the cambium layer, or maybe even insects that are stuck in the sap. Other animals will rub trees, and elk will oftentimes rub trees to try and help shed their velvet. Porcupines, of course, eat the outer bark. But if it's at the lower base of the tree with a lot of stripped branches and you can see some what look like tooth marks, it's probably a bear, an indication a bear has been active there. Bears will also leave long claw marks on individual trees in their territory. And again, this is like their calling card. This is telling other bears, this this territories. Mine go away, and they'll also leave scent marks by backing up to a tree and just rubbing their backs and leaving their scent on these trees. So they definitely leave their messages out in the backcountry and the woods by these kinds of signs. Particularly in moist areas up in the Pacific Northwest or up in the northwestern territories of Canada, you'll find these really interesting pathways referred to as bear trails. And it's amazing to think about these bears walking along the same trail over and over again in the same spot, step by step by step, many different bears leaving these trails, permanent trails to show that they've been in the area. So when I'm out backpacking and I see these trails, I move out of the area really quickly. I mentioned grizzly bear numbers have declined over through the 20th century. In 1975, they were listed as a threatened species with the Endangered Species Act. And since that time, their numbers are actually increasing and their range is expanding. With this concept, though, I always ask the question, why do we care about protecting species like grizzly bears? And, just kind of try and think about the significance of having animals like this, animals that are bigger than we are, that are really smart. And these animals represent big open space and wildness, and they need habitat that exists in places that we love. So my ending note for a program like this is typically to just say, I hope that there's always places where we can find tracks in the snow as the bears are coming out of their dens. And may we take only photographs and leave only footprints. And that is the end of these slides.
Well, thanks, Leslie. So we have several questions from the over 600 people in attendance right now. Our first question is about the average bear litter. What is the average size of a bear litter for a brown bear and for a black bear?
Okay, so for a black bear, it's pretty variable. They may have 2 cubs. Very common for them to have 3 cubs. There have been litters of cubs documented in the East, in Pennsylvania and New York State, of up to 5 cubs. So black bears will tend to have a much larger litter than grizzly bears. Typically 2, sometimes 3.
Interesting. In terms of hibernation, is there a difference between the 2 subspecies?
Between brown bears and grizzly bears?
Yep.
Those differences would, if there were differences, so if they were hibernating longer or in different areas, that would be a factor of the habitat where they're found. So it could be that bears in northern latitudes are hibernating for longer periods of time because it's covered with snow for a longer period of time. And the further south you go, when winters are shorter, those bears are likely hibernating for a shorter period of time.
Just a reminder for everyone out there, you can submit a question using the question and answer icon at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so what happens if a grizzly bear and a black bear meet, or brown bear?
Well, they're not going to shake claws.
Okay.
Typically, that's not a real common scenario because grizzly bears tend to dominate black bears. Oftentimes, black bears will avoid grizzly bears. If there was, as an example, a grizzly bear that was perhaps thinking about preying on black bear cubs, the female would be aggressive. The female black bear would be quite aggressive in protecting her cubs. But typically, in a confrontation between black bears and grizzly bears, a grizzly bear would win. If they're just kind of crossing paths in the night, they would tend to sort of avoid each other and ignore each other unless there was some kind of aggression.
In the yearling winters with the mother, how frequently do mothers get pregnant?
So a female breeds. She'll go, if it's successful, she'll go into the den with her cubs 2 years. She won't breed again if the cubs are coming in to the den for the 3rd year. So she will never breed as long as she has cubs. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question? Okay.
I think so.
So they may not breed every 3 to 4 to 5 years if they still have cubs.
So in terms of, we have a few questions about the lifespan of bears. Is there a difference between the grizzly bears and brown bears?
Not specifically. A lot of the age, so I would say an average age for, if a bear lives a long, full life and isn't, killed by a human or a predator, another predator, or in an accident on the road or something, they might live as long as 15, maybe 20 years in the wild. So, the main factor isn't species of bears, but what they confront in their lives. So if they're a bear that tends to get into a situation where it has become habituated with human foods, which tends to happen more with black bears, which is why I'm discussing this. More black bears die at an earlier age because of confrontations with humans. And it's not being aggressive towards humans, but getting into a food source or getting into an area where they become habituated. And so I would say that's the main reason why black bears would live shorter than grizzly bears.
We have several questions asking about, do you think the current coronavirus pandemic has influenced bear behavior, specifically in Yellowstone or perhaps in other areas? You can give your opinion.
Okay. I have to say, I don't think that it has directly affected bear behavior. But what I do think is that in places like, my neighborhood, Yellowstone Park, or maybe Grand Teton Parks, places where bears are protective and they're active this time of the year. They're out of their dens. They're starting to look for food. There haven't been people in the national parks. So I would say that at this point in time, it's very possible that bears have become much more comfortable coming down out of their dens. You may find them more widely around the riparian areas and looking for food and becoming very comfortable with the fact that they're not running into a lot of people. That's the only way I can think of how the virus might affect bear behavior.
We have some questions about hibernation. So Bill would like to know, do bears hibernate longer, tend to be smaller?
No.
Okay.
Bears in the northern parts of North America, for example, maybe bears in mainland Alaska, or even the Kodiak bears, which happen to be the largest brown bear in North America. They can be 1,500 pounds. Those bears hibernate for long periods of time because they have long winters. So, and black bears tend to be larger up in that area too, just because of their food sources. So I would say no.
Okay. Suzanne would like to know, if food sources are poor, will bears not hibernate?
Bears will hibernate. Bears do tend to hibernate less if there's food sources that are more abundant. So in areas throughout the Southwest, throughout Florida, when they don't run into a winter with weather constrictions, then they're going to stay more active throughout the winter. They might go down and bed for a few days, but if they can find food, they're not gonna hibernate. So typically they're hibernating because food availability isn't present.
Generally, do they live solo?
Yes. So bears are not herd animals. Really the only time you're going to find bears in a group would be mom with cubs, or maybe a group of cubs that are still attached, or you might find two adults together in the spring when it's the time of love. That's really the only time you're going to see adult bears together, unless there's a huge food source like the salmon spawning streams in Alaska or the huckleberry patches in Glacier. They'll be more tolerant of each other, but typically they're solo animals.
And Charlie wants to know, do females mate with the same male bears or different ones each time?
Bears are very promiscuous, so females will mate or breed with many males, and oftentimes many males in one season. So if she has fertilized eggs, each one of those eggs might have a different daddy. So they don't pair bond.
So we have lots of questions about your personal experience with bears, which I think is very, very broad. Can you just comment, in the past year, have you seen more grizzly bears or brown bears, or if there's anything specific, a memorable experience with bears that you'd like to share with us?
Well, my most recent, very exciting experience was the photo I showed in the beginning of my program talking about bears, with a bear with the long claws. That bear one morning just kind of was walking. It was moving from point A to point B, and it was moving through that property, and it started walking up toward the home I was staying in, jumped over the fence or climbed over the fence, kind of looked around a little bit and just kept on its way. And that was really an amazing opportunity to watch the bear moving and looking around. And it was really very fun and really incredible. One thing I want to share about experiences that I've had throughout my time here with bears, and even when I was younger, and I had a few experiences with bears in other parts of the world. Bears are not out to get us. So I've never had a bear. I've seen bears in a variety of different situations. I've never had a bear act aggressively. I've had times when I've had my bear spray in my hand because I wasn't sure what the bear was going to do, but I haven't ever encountered an aggressive scenario with a bear. And everything I talked about, all the precautions to take in bear country, I think it's important to practice those precautions, because I think that will prevent most bear-human encounters.
In terms of Yellowstone, how have wolves affected the bear populations?
It's interesting. There's a number of different observations that have been made. One of the more interesting ones is that it's since wolves have been back in Yellowstone, and there's about 100 wolves in Yellowstone now. So they're out throughout the year. They're in 10 or 11 packs, and they're hunting many days. So when they make a kill and they're having their breakfast, if those carcasses are out and the wolves are away from those carcasses, some of the older bears, and typically it's an older male, gets a sense that there's food available. Somehow they get that smell, and later into the winter season, people have observed bears out of their dens feeding on those carcasses that were killed by wolves. That's been one interesting behavior that's occurred since wolves have come back. It's not unusual for bears to move in on a carcass that's been killed by wolves. Even if the wolves are on that carcass, the bear and the wolves might have a tussle. Typically, the bear will win unless it's a big pack of wolves. But those are the kinds of things that have been noticed, interaction between bears and wolves.
A few more questions. Merle would like to know, what area is the most populated with bears in the U.S.? The Northwest or parts of Florida, Georgia, etc.?
Well, I would say that for black bears, the population is probably highest throughout the western part of the United States. Grizzly bears, the highest population of bears is north of the US-Canada border. Higher populations up in Canada and up into Alaska.
And do male bears hibernate?
Yes, all bears kind of north of a certain climate zone will hibernate.
And the last question that we have is, so this is a question from Rebecca. She says that she was told by a park ranger that during hibernation or gestation, if they are malnourished, would their bodies absorb the fetus? Is this a myth?
Well, typically if they're malnourished, that egg won't start to develop. So I mentioned that adaptation called delayed implantation. And if they're malnourished, she'll shed those eggs. So maybe that's what the park ranger was explaining, that a female bear that's bred, if she's pregnant, if those eggs are fertilized, by the time she's going into her den, her body will have given her the signal if she's going to be able to survive the winter nursing those cubs. So typically, those eggs haven't developed by the time she'll shed those eggs.
And actually, let's have one more question here. So in terms of cubs, how long do the cubs stay with the mother?
They stay with mom through the first winter, the first summer, the next winter. And it depends on individual family groups, I guess, how long they stay through that second summer. Typically, they're all separate from mom that second summer, but occasionally a cub or a group of cubs may go back into the den with mom. The third winter, she'll definitely boot them out the next summer if that's
Okay. Well, Leslie, thank you so much. This was your second lecture, and for those of you that are interested, you can also look at Leslie's first lecture, which was on Greater in Yellowstone, more focused on Yellowstone National Park on our virtual lecture library. Leslie, have a great day, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone.